In the autumn of 1568, inside a dim curtained chamber of the Alcazar of Madrid, a young queen lay dying. She was 22 years old. She was, by the unanimous account of ambassadors, painters, and poets across Europe, one of the most beautiful women who had ever worn a crown. And yet, as her body was carried through the palace corridors in secrecy, whispers followed her that had nothing to do with sickness. They spoke of poison. They spoke of jealousy. They spoke of a love triangle so dangerous that it may have cost a queen her life. Her name was Isabel de Valois, third wife of King Philip II of Spain, and her death would become one of the great unsolved mysteries of the Spanish court. But her story was only the beginning. For centuries, the queens of Spain were not simply political wives chosen for alliances and bloodlines. Many of them were extraordinary beauties whose faces launched wars, whose portraits were fought over by kings, and whose very existence reshaped the destiny of an empire. This is the untold story of the most beautiful queens in Spanish history. Women whose beauty was both their greatest gift and, in some cases, the very thing that destroyed them. To understand why beauty mattered so much in the Spanish court, you have to understand what a queen actually was in that world. She was not simply a wife, she was a living symbol of the kingdom itself, paraded before ambassadors, painted by the greatest artists of the age, and used as a bargaining chip in the marriage markets of Europe. A beautiful queen was proof that a dynasty was blessed, that its bloodline was strong, that its future was secure. Kings sent painters across entire continents just to capture a potential bride's face before committing to marriage. Sometimes an entire war of succession, an entire alliance between empires, hinged on nothing more than a portrait and the hope that the woman in it was as lovely in person as she appeared on canvas. It was a dangerous game, and some of the women who played it became legends not just for their power, but for a beauty so striking that it was recorded again and again by people who had every reason to exaggerate and yet still could not stop talking about them. Long before Isabel de Valois arrived in Spain, there was Isabella I of Castile, the queen who would unite Spain, fund Christopher Columbus, and change the course of world history. She is remembered today primarily as a political and military force, the woman who forged a unified Spanish kingdom out of fractured, warring territories. But in her own time, chroniclers described her with an almost reverent astonishment at her appearance. She had fair skin, auburn hair, and blue-green eyes so striking that visiting diplomats specifically wrote home about them. Beauty, in Isabella's case, was fused with an iron will. She rode into battle. She negotiated with popes. And she did it all while foreign courts murmured that Castile's queen was as lovely as she was formidable. It was a combination the Spanish crown would see again and again in the centuries that followed. Women whose faces captivated Europe even as their minds and ambitions shaped nations. But not every beautiful queen of Spain found power. Some found heartbreak so devastating it consumed them entirely. Isabella's own daughter, Joanna, inherited her mother's striking looks, but she also inherited something far more fragile, a heart that loved too deeply and a mind that could not survive betrayal. Joanna married Philip the Handsome, a Habsburg prince as beautiful as his name suggested, and by all accounts, she fell for him with an obsessive, consuming passion. For a time, it seemed like a fairy tale. But Philip was unfaithful, repeatedly and publicly, and Joanna's jealousy spiraled into something the court could no longer explain away as simple heartbreak. When Philip died suddenly in 1506, Joanna's grief became the stuff of legend. Stories spread that she refused to let his coffin be buried, that she opened it herself again and again just to look at his face, that she traveled across Castile with his body in a funeral procession that lasted for months. History remembers her as Juana la Loca, Joanna the Mad. But strip away the sensational legend, and what remains is a woman whose beauty and whose capacity to love were so intense that they may have cost her everything, including her freedom. She would spend the last 46 years of her life confined, officially for her own protection, in the fortress of Tordesillas, while her son and later her grandson ruled in her name. Was she truly mad, or was she simply an inconvenient queen, too beautiful, too passionate, too difficult to control? Historians still argue about it today, which brings the story back to Isabel de Valois, the young queen whose mysterious death opened this documentary. She arrived in Spain from France in 1560, a teenage bride sent to seal a fragile peace between two great rival powers. She was just 14 years old, and Philip II, more than twice her age, had originally intended her for his own son, the troubled prince Don Carlos. Instead, the marriage terms shifted, and Isabel became the king's wife rather than his daughter-in-law, a twist of political fate that would fuel scandalous rumors for the rest of her short life. Contemporary accounts describe her as radiant, graceful, and warm, a French rose transplanted into the rigid formality of the Spanish court, and utterly beloved by the people of Madrid, who called her Isabel de la Paz, Isabel of Peace. But the whispers never stopped. Courtiers noticed how close she remained to her stepson, Don Carlos, the very prince she had once been promised to. Was it innocent affection between two young people thrown together by cruel circumstance? Or was it something more dangerous, something that threatened the stability of the throne itself? When Don Carlos was suddenly imprisoned by his own father in 1568 under mysterious and still debated circumstances and died in confinement just months later, the court held its breath. And then, only months after that, Isabel herself, pregnant with what should have been her fourth child, collapsed and died within days. Officially, she died from complications of a miscarriage. But the timing was so suspicious, so tightly wound around the death of Don Carlos, that rumors of poison and palace conspiracy followed her to the grave and have never fully been silenced. Centuries later, her story would inspire Verdi's opera Don Carlos and countless dramatizations, all circling the same haunting question: did the most beloved queen in Spain die of natural causes, or did her beauty and the dangerous devotion it inspired become her death sentence? If Isabel de Valois represented beauty entangled with tragedy, then Maria Luisa of Parma, queen consort during the turbulent reign of Charles IV 2 centuries later, represented something else entirely: beauty weaponized by propaganda. When the court painter Francisco Goya was commissioned to paint the royal family in 1800, he produced one of the most startling group portraits in the history of art. Maria Luisa stands at its center, and Goya did not flatter her the way royal painters were expected to. Political enemies and gossiping courtiers had long mocked her appearance, spreading cruel caricatures and rumors about her supposed vanity and her scandalous relationship with the Prime Minister, Manuel Godoy. But historical accounts from earlier in her life tell a very different story, describing a vivacious, striking young woman whose charm and magnetic presence captivated the Spanish court long before scandal and the passage of time reshaped her public image. Her story is a warning about how quickly a queen's reputation and even her beauty could be rewritten by politics, propaganda, and the brutal court of public opinion. What she actually looked like became almost irrelevant. What mattered was the story people wanted to tell about her, and in Maria Luisa's case, that story was designed to destroy her. Not every celebrated Spanish beauty stayed within the borders of Spain. Perhaps the most internationally famous of them all never technically wore the Spanish crown at all, but rather carried Spanish beauty onto an even grander European stage. Eugénie de Montijo was born in Granada in 1826, the daughter of a Spanish count, raised amid the same fierce sun and dramatic history that had shaped generations of Spanish queens before her. She grew into a young woman so extraordinarily beautiful that she became one of the most talked about women in all of Europe, with flame-red hair, porcelain skin, and a magnetic presence that turned heads in every ballroom she entered. When she traveled to Paris, she caught the eye of Napoleon III, nephew of the legendary Napoleon Bonaparte and now Emperor of France himself. Napoleon III proposed marriage, and in 1853, the Spanish beauty from Granada became Empress of the French, one of the most powerful women on the entire continent. Her wedding gown, her jewels, her fashion choices, all of it sent ripples through European high society. And for nearly 2 decades, she reigned as a tastemaker whose Spanish elegance defined an era. But her story, like so many of these queens before her, would not end in triumph. When the Franco-Prussian War shattered Napoleon III's empire in 1870, Eugénie was forced to flee Paris in disguise, escaping through a side door of the Louvre as an angry mob closed in on the palace. The woman whose beauty had once dazzled an empire spent her final decades in exile in England, outliving her husband, her son, and the empire she once ruled. She died in 1920 at the astonishing age of 94, having witnessed her own transformation from celebrated beauty to political refugee to elder stateswoman of a vanished world. There is another chapter to this story that unfolded not in the marriage beds and death chambers of the Spanish court, but on canvas in the studios of the greatest painters Europe ever produced. For over a century, the Habsburg kings of Spain relied on court painters like Diego Velázquez and later Juan Carreño de Miranda to send portraits of eligible Spanish princesses to potential husbands across Europe, and those portraits carried an almost unbearable weight. A single painting could make or break a royal marriage negotiation that had taken years to arrange. Velázquez's portraits of the young Infanta Margaret Teresa, painted throughout her childhood and sent regularly to her intended husband, Emperor Leopold I, in Vienna, were not simply art. They were diplomatic documents, evidence of a bloodline's vitality, proof that the famously inbred Habsburg dynasty could still produce children who were healthy, graceful, and beautiful enough to secure an empire's future. Margaret Teresa herself, immortalized forever in Velázquez's masterpiece Las Meninas, would grow up almost entirely within the walls of the Alcazar, groomed from infancy for a marriage that had been planned before she could even speak, her beauty cataloged and transmitted across Europe in oil paint long before she ever set foot outside Spain. She married Leopold at just 15 years old and died only 6 years later, worn down by a string of difficult pregnancies in a foreign court thousands of miles from home, another young queen whose famous painted beauty could not protect her from the brutal realities of dynastic duty. Even in the modern era, the fascination with the beauty of Spain's queens has never truly faded. It has simply changed shape. When Letizia Ortiz, a former television news anchor from a middle-class Spanish family, married Crown Prince Felipe in 2004 and later became queen consort, the global press descended on her with the same intensity that once surrounded Eugénie de Montijo's rise from Granada to the imperial court of Paris. Letizia's striking, camera-ready features and effortless elegance made her an instant fixture of fashion magazines and royal watchers worldwide, proof that even in a democratic 21st century Spain, the ancient fascination with a queen's face has lost none of its power. The crowns and the empires have changed almost beyond recognition since the days of Isabella of Castile, but the underlying pattern remains eerily familiar. A striking woman steps into public life, and the world cannot look away. What connects all of these women, separated by centuries, is not simply that they were beautiful. It is that their beauty was never allowed to be a private, personal thing. It was public property, endlessly discussed, painted, gossiped about, and politicized. A queen's face could seal an alliance or spark a war. It could inspire devoted love or paranoid jealousy. It could be celebrated by court poets one decade and mocked by political cartoonists the next, all depending on which way the winds of power happened to be blowing. Isabella of Castile's beauty was fused so completely with her power that history remembers her as a conqueror first and a beauty second. Joanna's beauty and her capacity for love became evidence, however unfairly, of madness. Isabel de Valois' beauty made her beloved by an entire kingdom and possibly cost her her life. Maria Luisa's beauty was rewritten by her enemies until the woman and the caricature became impossible to separate. And Eugénie de Montijo's beauty carried her from a Spanish villa to an imperial throne in Paris, and then into decades of quiet exile. Each of these women discovered, in her own devastating way, that being celebrated as one of the most beautiful women in Europe was never simply a gift. It was a spotlight that never turned off, one that illuminated every triumph and magnified every vulnerability, every rumor, every mistake. There is a reason these stories still captivate us centuries later. Long after the empires these women helped build or represent have faded into history books and museum halls. Their portraits still hang in the Prado in Madrid, in the Louvre in Paris, in palaces and galleries across Europe, and visitors still stop in front of them, still search their painted faces for some trace of the women who once breathed, loved, suffered, and ruled behind those famous eyes. Because behind every legendary beauty was a human being navigating an impossibly difficult world, a world where her value was too often measured by her appearance rather than her intelligence, her courage, or her heart. Isabella built a nation. Joanna loved with a devotion the world called madness. Isabel de Valois brought peace between warring kingdoms and paid an unbearable price. Maria Luisa endured a cruelty that history is only now beginning to correct. And Eugénie rose from a noble Spanish family to an imperial throne, only to lose everything and rebuild her life from nothing. Their faces made them famous. Their strength, their sorrow, and their resilience are what should make them remembered. And perhaps that is the final quiet revelation at the heart of this story, that the most beautiful queens in Spanish history were never defined by their beauty at all, but by everything they endured because of it. Their portraits may have captured a single, frozen moment of loveliness, but their true legacy lives in the extraordinary, complicated, unforgettable lives that beauty alone could never fully explain.